The trackers in the Painted Canyon still speak of the 94 seconds that decided a man's soul. Chayton wasn't looking for a miracle from a white god. He was just an Apache father, his rope cut, his son clutched to his chest as the ledge crumbled beneath his feet. His world had shrunk to the wind's howl and the shifting of rock. Then he looked up and saw her. Not a spirit, but an impossible vision against the sky. A corpulent noblewoman, her fine dress torn and filthy, her body braced against the rock like an ancient immovable oak. Her face was a mask of brutal, gritting effort, her soft hands raw and bleeding as she held the line. Cold, logical survival told Chayton this was a trap, another lie from her kind. But his son's life rested in those bleeding hands. The choice between a lifetime of bitter experience and a single desperate act of faith would be made before the last of the ledge turned to dust. He had 1 minute. Lady Beatrice Hemlock considered the fine terracotta-colored dust coating her silk traveling gown to be a personal affront. It was, she had decided, an act of sheer vulgarity on the part of the Arizona Territory. Every gust of wind was an insult, every jolt of the carriage a trial. She had spent the last 2 weeks cataloging her miseries in a leather-bound journal, her elegant script a stark contrast to the brutal landscape she described. Her world was one of textures, the scratch of a poorly stuffed cushion, the unbearable heat radiating through the canvas roof, the grit of sand that seemed to find its way into every sealed container. Her 2 guides, hired men with sun-cured faces and a maddeningly quiet competence, treated her with a deference that felt more like pity than respect. She was cargo, an expensive, complaining piece of cargo. The leader, Silas Kane, was the worst. He moved with a chilling economy of motion, his eyes missing nothing. When he spoke, his words were flat and final, like stones dropping into a well. He never wasted a gesture or a syllable, a stark condemnation of Beatrice's own perceived uselessness. She felt her irrelevance in the way he never quite met her gaze, his focus always on the horizon, the horses, the angle of the sun, anything but the woman whose exorbitant fee was funding this entire miserable expedition. This feeling, this slow erasure of her own importance, was a heavier burden than any of the countless trunks strapped to the carriage. The trail narrowed, forcing them to abandon the carriage and proceed on horseback along a high, wind-scoured ledge. The drop was a dizzying spectacle of red rock and shadow. Kane called a halt, his hand raised. Ahead, a lone Apache man and a child were inching their way along the same path. Kane's voice was devoid of emotion. "We'll wait." Beatrice saw the impatience in the other guide's eyes, a twitch in his jaw. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind. Then, with a sound like tearing cloth, a section of the trail beneath the Apache man gave way. He scrabbled for purchase, a rope, his only connection to his packhorse on the trail above, snapping taut. But the packhorse, spooked, shrieked and bolted, the severed end of the rope whipping through the air. The man dangled, his son clutched in one arm, his fingers locked onto a precarious handhold. "Well," Kane said, his voice as flat as the horizon, "that's the end of that. Let's find a wider spot to turn back." He saw it not as a tragedy, but as an inconvenience, a delay in his timetable. His men shifted, their expressions hard, already dismissing the scene. Chayton, clinging to the rock face, saw the white men look away. He expected nothing more. His son coughed, a small puff of dust against his chest, but Beatrice saw it. She saw the tiny hand clinging to the man's neck. Her world of silk and dust and personal affronts dissolved in an instant. The locket around her neck, a cold, secret weight she had carried for years, suddenly felt searingly hot against her skin. Before a thought could form, her body moved. She slid from her horse, her considerable weight hitting the ground with a solid thud. She grabbed the frayed end of the packhorse's rope lying in the dust. Her soft, uncalloused hands protested, the rough hemp biting into her skin. "What in God's name are you doing, madam?" Kane's voice was sharp with annoyance. Beatrice ignored him. She braced herself, planting her feet, her body a solid, unmoving anchor against the cracked earth. The rope went taut. Chayton's weight and his son's settled into her hands, a shocking, brutal reality. The sheer force of it drove a grunt from her lips. Both Chayton and Kane's men stared, mouths agape. It was impossible. This soft, complaining woman from another world was now the only thing tethering two lives to existence. She held the line, her face a grimace of agony and absolute refusal. For the first time in years, Lady Beatrice Hemlock was not an ornament. She was essential, and she would not let go. Silence. It was not a silence of peace, but a heavy, watchful quiet that fell after Beatrice hauled Chayton and his son onto the solid ground of the trail. The other guide averted his eyes, unable to meet her gaze, but Silas Kane's eyes were like chips of frozen river water. He did not look at her with gratitude or even surprise. He looked at her with the cold fury of a man whose meticulously arranged chessboard had just been overturned by a meddling fool. His voice, when it came, was a silken threat. An impressive and foolish display, my lady. The canyon is unstable. He gestured vaguely up at the rock face. We should move, quickly. His hand rested near the pistol on his hip, a gesture that was not meant to reassure. The canyon tragedy Kane spoke of was not a possibility. It was a promise. Before anyone could react, a sharp crack echoed from above. It was not the sound of nature, but the distinct percussive blast of dynamite. A horrific, grinding groan filled the air as a slab of the canyon wall the size of a church began to shear away. Kane and his men were already scrambling back, their retreat too organized, too practiced. Dust and rock exploded, the world dissolving into a choking, red-brown chaos. The ground beneath Beatrice's feet bucked and fell away. Chayton, moving with a speed she couldn't comprehend, grabbed her, his son cradled in his other arm, and threw them into a narrow fissure in the rock as the thunder of the rockslide consumed everything. When the dust settled, they were alone. The trail ahead and behind was gone, replaced by a mountain of fresh rubble. Kane and his party were nowhere to be seen. Chayton stood, his body a tense line of coiled energy, his gaze sweeping their surroundings with an expert's eye. He instantly found a game trail, almost invisible to Beatrice, and pointed. They had to move. Beatrice, her fine dress in tatters, her lungs full of grit, nodded. Every instinct screamed to Chayton to leave this clumsy, useless white woman behind. She was a liability, but her bleeding hands told a different story. For now, their survival was yoked to this alliance of pure, raw distrust. Days bled into a fever dream of sun and stone. Beatrice's initial surge of adrenaline had long since given way to the brutal reality of their situation. Her expensive, impractical shoes were shredded, her feet blistered and bleeding. Chayton moved through the hostile landscape like a spirit, finding water where there was only rock, reading signs in the bent grass that were invisible to her. He was a paragon of competence. She was once again cargo. By the third day, the heat and exhaustion took their toll. A fever began to burn behind her eyes, her body racked with shivers despite the oppressive heat. She collapsed. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of moments. The cool, damp feel of a poultice on her forehead, the bitter, earthy taste of a tea Chayton pressed to her lips. In a moment of delirium, she felt him gently untangle the chain of the locket from around her neck. Her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. No, she rasped. He did not pull away. He simply waited. Her grip loosened, and he carefully opened the clasp. It was a heavy, ornate piece of English silver, grotesquely out of place in this world of rock and dust. Inside, nestled against the velvet, was not a portrait, but a single tiny curl of spun gold hair. Her hidden self. Chayton looked from the lock of hair to the sleeping face of his own son. He didn't need to understand the details. He understood the language of loss. For the first time, he saw not a white woman, not an enemy, but a fellow survivor marked by a grief as profound as his own. His animosity softened into something less certain, more complex. He saw a kindred spirit, and he gently replaced the locket around her neck. Later, her fever broken, Beatrice sat huddled by a small fire, while Chayton scouted ahead. She found a leather satchel that had been caught in the strap of her saddle during the rockslide one of Kane's. She opened it, expecting to find rations or rope. Instead, her fingers brushed against the cold, precise edges of brass and steel. It was filled with sophisticated surveying equipment, a surveyor's compass, a gunter's chain, and rolled oilskin maps. She unrolled one. It was a meticulously detailed topographical map of the very canyon they were in, but it was marked with straight, confident lines and numbered survey points, titled Transcontinental Rail Line, Proposed Southern Route. This was Apache land, protected by treaty. She felt a cold dread creep up her spine, the rock slide, the cut rope. It was no accident. They weren't stranded. They were targets. They were loose ends in a conspiracy far larger and more ruthless than she could have imagined. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Kane wasn't just a guide, he was an executioner, and he was still out there. The vast, indifferent wilderness no longer felt like a random threat. It felt like a hunting ground. And they were the prey. Kane was as relentless as the sun. Chayton saw the signs. A disturbed pebble, a broken branch too fresh to be natural. They were being herded, pushed deeper into the canyon. "He is driving us toward the river," Chayton whispered, his voice tight, "away from the high ground." They made a desperate run for a narrow, defensible pass. As Beatrice scrambled up the rocks, a rifle shot echoed through the canyon. It wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed at Chayton, who had deliberately exposed himself on a high ridge to draw their fire. He cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and tumbled behind a rock outcropping. The bullet had caught him in the leg. Beatrice's blood ran cold. He was down. The protector was incapacitated. All the old feelings of helplessness, of being a useless soft woman in a hard world, crashed down upon her. She was alone with a wounded man and a child, hunted by an expert who knew this land as well as his own hand. For a terrifying moment, her spirit broke. She could see Kane in her mind's eye, his cold, professional face, and she knew he had already won. Then, through the fog of her despair, a memory surfaced, a trivial thing from her old life, an illustration in one of her father's botany books. Yarrow, the herb that staunches bleeding. She looked at the scrubby, resilient plants clinging to the rocks around her, her eyes scanning desperately. It was a flicker of knowledge, a fragment of her forgotten self, a tiny, almost imperceptible glimmer of a chance. A tool from a dead world that just might be the key to surviving this one. They took refuge in a high, shallow cave that smelled of ancient dust and dry stone. Chayton, his leg tightly bound with strips torn from Beatrice's petticoat and packed with the yarrow she had found, was teaching her to see. Not just to look, but to see. He pointed out how the lizards always sunned themselves on the rocks that held the most warmth, a clue to finding shelter for the night. He showed her how a particular lichen only grew where moisture seeped from the rock, a desperate but life-saving source of water. He spoke little, his words chosen with the same care he used to whittle a trap trigger. It was a language of competence, and for the first time, Beatrice felt herself beginning to understand. While Chayton rested, his son asleep at his side, Beatrice unrolled Kane's oilskin map. It had become her obsession. The lines and numbers were a code she was determined to break. For days she had seen only chaos in Kane's pursuit, the random terror of a predator chasing his prey. But that wasn't right. Kane was a man of cold logic, a creature of straight lines and objectives. His pursuit wasn't chaotic, it was a vector. He wasn't just searching for them, he was pushing them. Her finger traced their desperate flight across the topographical lines, then traced the confident, arrogant path Kane had drawn for his railroad. Her breath caught. He wasn't herding them away from anything. He was herding them to a specific point, a high, isolated rock spire marked with a bold final X. Survey Point 7. He needed to reach it to complete his mission. The realization struck her not like lightning, but like the slow, grinding turn of a key in a rusty lock. In that moment, her own self-perception, the lifetime of believing she was a woman of feelings but not of intellect, of substance but not of strategy, crumbled to dust. Her blindness fell away. This canyon was not a prison. It was a weapon waiting to be wielded. She looked at the map, then at the towering rock formations around her, no longer with fear, but with the cold, calculating eye of a general surveying the battlefield. She knew what she had to do. The intense anticipation of it, the sheer audacity of her plan, was a more potent tonic than any she had yet consumed. She would use Kane's own ambition as the bait for his own destruction. The rock spire stood alone, a finger of stone pointing an accusation at the sky. This was Point 7. This was Kane's altar. Beatrice positioned herself in the open at its base, a perfect vulnerable target. Chayton, his son safely hidden, was perched high above, his injured leg braced against a key support rock he had spent the last hour meticulously weakening. The weight was excruciating. Then he appeared. Silas Kane emerged from the rocks, his rifle held loosely, his face a mask of triumphant condescension. "I must confess, my lady," he said, his voice dripping with mock admiration, "I underestimated your resilience, a commendable, if ultimately futile, effort." He was close now, his eyes fixed on her. He had won. This land is a necessary sacrifice for progress, for the future. The lives of a few insignificant people are simply the price, a fact you, in your soft world, cannot possibly grasp. "I grasp this," Beatrice said, her voice steady. He followed her gaze. She was looking at the surveyor's tripod and the expensive, gleaming brass theodolite he had set up to take his final reading. At that precise moment, Chayton, with a grunt of effort, threw his weight against the weakened rock. A single, sharp crack echoed. It wasn't a thunderous roar. It was a precise, surgical sound. Kane looked up, his expression of smug superiority dissolving into pure, uncomprehending shock. The rockslide Beatrice had envisioned was not a chaotic deluge. It was a strategic amputation. A river of stone and dust flowed with terrifying precision, not toward them, but directly onto his survey point. There was the sound of splintering wood and the sickening crunch of metal and glass as his precious equipment, the very purpose of his entire mission, was buried under 100 tons of rock. He was unharmed, but his mission, his reputation, his future was utterly destroyed. Justice, Beatrice realized, was not always about blood. Sometimes it was about erasure. As Kane stared, a broken man, at the tomb of his ambition, figures appeared on the ridge above. Chayton's people. They moved with silent grace, their presence an undeniable statement of ownership. Kane did not even look at them. He simply turned and walked away into the wilderness, a man with nothing left to claim. The following spring, the world was green again. In the territorial governor's office, Lady Beatrice Hemlock, dressed not in silk, but in practical, durable linen, signed the final page of the deed. With a fortune her family had deemed ornamental, she had legally purchased the entire Painted Canyon territory. In the line designated for the new owner, she had not written her own name. She had written the name of Chayton's tribe. It was a fortress of paper and law, a sanctuary built to last for generations. Her legacy would not be a bloodline, but a horizon. Her final day in the territory, she stood on a bluff overlooking the canyon. It was no longer a place of terror, but of profound beauty. Chayton approached, his son walking beside him. He did not offer words of thanks. His culture's gratitude was a deeper thing than that. He simply held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a single perfect eagle feather, a symbol of the highest honor, of kinship, of a debt that could never be paid but would be forever acknowledged. Beatrice took it, her once soft fingers now strong and sure. She thought her worth was in her title and her fortune, something to be carried. But now she knew her true worth was found in her strength to hold the line, not just for 94 seconds, but for every moment that followed. The trackers who still tell the story say, a woman's soul was not the one decided that day. It was the one that was finally and truly forged.